This happened when I was about 15 years old. My mom and I were at Target, shopping as usual. There was nothing special about that day, and we weren't in a hurry. I was wandering through the aisles, as I often did, casually browsing before returning to my mom later. I was in one of the aisles, minding my own business, when suddenly a woman I had never seen before approached me and hugged me tightly. It wasn't a normal or polite hug. It was deep, emotional, almost desperate. At first, I wasn't alarmed. I come from a Latin family and we're used to hugging. Even from distant relatives we may not recognize right away. I assumed she might be an old friend of my mom's or a long-lost aunt who hadn't seen me since I was little, but I quickly realized something was off. She held on for too long and I could hear her gasping, as if she were crying. Then she called me by a name that wasn't mine. I don't remember exactly what it was, so let's say it was Eliza. She whispered, "Eliza, my love, I've missed you so much." At that moment, I felt a deep unease. I gently pulled away and politely told her she was mistaken, that I wasn't Eliza, and that we had never met before. I expected it to be a simple misunderstanding, something we could laugh about before she apologized and moved on. But things took a dark turn. She stared at my face, her expression shifting into something eerie and unsettling, as if she hadn't even heard me. Her eyes filled with tears, and she reached out to touch my face, as if trying to convince herself I was real. Then she whispered, in a broken voice unlike anything I had ever heard before, "But, my dear, you're dead." I felt my stomach drop. This wasn't just a case of mistaken identity. This woman was completely convinced, without a doubt, that I was her deceased daughter. She continued speaking as if in shock, saying, "Why did you die, my love? Where have you been? I buried you. I saw you in that car. But you're here now. Thank God you're here." I didn't know what to do. A rational part of me understood that this was just a tragic case of misidentification, but the way she looked at me made me doubt myself for a moment. A strange thought crossed my mind. What if she's right? What if I am Eliza and just don't remember? I told her again that I wasn't her daughter, but she refused to accept it. Through her tears, she smiled and shook her head as if I were joking, saying, "Of course you're my daughter. A mother knows her child's face." You might think this woman was mentally unstable, maybe homeless or under the influence of something, but she wasn't. She looked completely normal, well-dressed, groomed, wearing makeup and carrying a shopping basket full of everyday items. There was nothing about her appearance that suggested she was lost or confused. Everything about her was ordinary, except for the fact that she was absolutely convinced I was her dead child. The more she spoke, the more panic I felt. I was trapped, like I was losing my grip on reality. I couldn't handle the weight of her words, or the intensity of her emotions, so I mumbled something incoherent and ran out of the aisle as fast as I could, searching for my mom until I found her. I expected my mom to brush it off, maybe even laugh when I told her what happened. But the look on her face when she heard me was even more terrifying than what I had felt with that woman. My mom isn't the overprotective type. She always gives me a lot of independence. But for the rest of our time in the store, she never let me out of her sight. She held onto my arm as we walked, kept looking around constantly, and made me stand right next to her while checking out. She was scared, and that scared me even more. That incident stayed with me for a long time. For weeks afterward, I was afraid that someone else, a father, a brother, a grandmother, someone from Eliza's family, would approach me with that same terrible mix of sorrow and recognition. Luckily, it never happened again, but to this day I still think about that woman. In early December, I went out for some late-night shopping. I'm a 31-year-old mother taking care of two young children at home, so when my husband comes back from work, I take some time for myself to go shopping, drive around, or run errands alone, away from the kids. I arrived at my usual Target store around 8:30 p.m. I'm not naturally paranoid or overly anxious, but I've taken several human trafficking prevention courses and done a lot of personal research on how to recognize warning signs and the precautions I should always take when I'm out alone, especially at night. I always carry multiple self-defense tools, just in case. I parked my car right in front of the store, next to the shopping cart area, and made a mental note of the cars parked nearby as a precaution. I was taught from a young age to always be aware of my surroundings, and my naturally cautious personality makes me act this way. There was nothing unusual that night. The parking lot was nearly empty, likely because it was a weekday. As I entered the store, I started browsing as usual, following my normal path through the main aisle sections. After about 10 to 15 minutes of browsing, I noticed a young man in his mid-20s, tall and thin, wearing a dirty gray tracksuit and dark brown boots. He looked at me, so I smiled and said, "Hi," but his face remained completely blank. His eyes had a glazed-over look, as if he was under the influence of something, but he showed no reaction to my greeting and quickly walked away. At first, there was nothing too concerning about him, except that I noticed he was wandering around the main aisle without a cart or basket, his hands stuffed into his pockets, and he wasn't with anyone. I continued shopping, not thinking too much about it, and moved on to the next section. A few minutes later, I noticed another young man who looked almost identical, wearing the same gray tracksuit and brown work boots, also without a cart or basket. He glanced at me briefly, then quickly looked away the moment he realized I was looking directly at him. I started to feel uneasy, but remained calm and kept browsing. After another 15 minutes, a third man caught my attention. He looked older, but he was wearing the same gray tracksuit and the same type of boots, also without a cart or basket, with his hands in his pockets. At that moment, I assumed they might be wearing some kind of work uniform, maybe construction workers. But why weren't they walking together? And why weren't they buying anything? It became harder for me to focus on shopping, and I started to feel like something was off. Over the next 20 minutes, I felt like I was being watched by these three men, as if they were coordinating their movements around me. Every section I entered, it wouldn't take long before one of them would appear, walking past me, making sure I noticed their presence. I tried not to let panic take over, but a sense of danger began to grow inside me, so I decided to test the situation to make sure I wasn't overreacting. I started moving randomly between aisles without any clear pattern, just to see if they would continue following me. And as I suspected, every time I entered an aisle, one of them would show up a few minutes later, glancing at me as he passed by. I felt like prey being hunted. What scared me the most was that they weren't even trying to hide their movements anymore. They were making it obvious. At that moment, every instinct in my body was screaming at me to get out of there immediately. I'd been shopping for over an hour and was ready to leave, but I felt so uneasy that I couldn't even focus on browsing anymore. The store was nearly empty, which is one of the reasons I enjoy shopping at night, but it also made the situation even more terrifying. I noticed two young girls wandering around alone, and I saw the men approaching them the same way they had approached me. The girls seemed completely unaware of what was happening, so I quickly but calmly walked over to them and told them to go find their parents and stay with them, trying not to scare them. As I headed toward the checkout area, I saw one of the men approaching me from behind with quick steps. I immediately stopped and turned to look him directly in the eyes. I will never forget the dark look in his eyes or the sinister smirk that spread across his face as he walked past me, brushing his shoulder against mine, all while continuing to stare at me as he walked backward toward the exit. At that moment, I felt true fear, and my entire body began to shake, a feeling I hadn't experienced since I was a little girl lost in a crowded store. I quickly walked to the cashier and asked to speak to the manager, explaining everything that had happened and requesting that a male employee walk me to my car. The shock on the manager's face made it clear that she already knew about these men. When I described them to her, she confirmed that she was aware of them and that several female employees had felt uncomfortable around them before. She filed a report and alerted security, and then a male employee accompanied me to my car. What I saw when I stepped outside made my stomach drop. A white van with no windows was parked directly behind my car. One of the men was sitting in the driver's seat, while the other two were leaning against the side of the van, trying to stay out of sight. When I pointed them out to the employee, they all quickly jumped into the van and sped out of the parking lot. I can't even imagine what could have happened if I had walked out to my car alone. I am so incredibly grateful that I made it home safely to tell my story. The following week, I heard about several attempted kidnappings at the same shopping center, and I am almost certain it was the same men. Human trafficking is very real, extremely dangerous, and can happen to anyone. You should always stay aware of your surroundings. If you're here for the first time, don't forget to subscribe to our channel and turn on the notification bell to stay updated with our upcoming scary stories. We need your support. Please share these stories with your friends and family. I used to work at Target a few years ago. I worked inside the store in the sales department, particularly in the grocery section. During this period, I was a part-time employee, working about 20 to 30 hours a week. One night, I was working a regular shift for me, from 4 p.m. to 10 p.m. When I started, the store was somewhat busy, and I was moving around one side of the store performing my tasks, which mostly involved stocking shelves and organizing products. I was also answering customers' questions and guiding them to the locations of the products they were looking for. At that time, I had been working for about 6 months, and I knew the store like the back of my hand. By around 9:30 p.m., the store started becoming very quiet. We closed at 11 p.m., so it wasn't closing time yet, but it was noticeably calm. Many of my coworkers had already left, and the night shift team had started arriving. In the grocery section, it was easy to stay busy since it had more shoppers and required more attention. All employees at Target carried walkie-talkies for communication. I heard someone calling my name over the device, so I responded. I wasn't sure who it was, but they asked me to switch to the next channel, so I did. I was used to receiving calls over the walkie-talkie, and it was usually about going to another section of the store or taking a break. As I switched channels, I wondered who was calling me. After switching, I announced my presence, but at first I didn't hear anything. After a few seconds, I heard a creepy laugh that lasted for a while. I spoke again, asking who it was, but there was no response. Just more laughter. When I asked again, I started suspecting that it was just a joke. But then the laughter suddenly stopped, and the person called me by name. It was a man's voice, speaking in a deep tone as if he was trying to alter it. Then he said he was waiting for me in the parking lot. I chuckled a little, thinking it was just a prank, especially since we were about to finish our shifts. But I couldn't figure out who the person was. I continued working and soon finished my tasks, allowing me to clock out. I went to the employee area, grabbed my things, and exited through the store's door. The parking lot was very quiet, with most of the cars belonging to employees parked in the middle. My car was parked in the back corner since the store had been busy when I arrived. As I walked toward my car, I noticed another vehicle parked near mine, about 100 feet away. Its engine was running. When I reached my car and was about to get in, that car started moving, but it was heading toward me quickly. I didn't recognize the vehicle, and it didn't belong to anyone I knew. I quickly jumped into my car and locked the doors. The other car then stopped next to me, but it was facing the opposite direction. I looked over, but its windows were too tinted for me to see inside. At that moment, I remembered what the person on the walkie-talkie had said. Was it not a joke? I had a bad feeling about it, so I decided to drive away. As I started leaving, the car began moving as well, following me. That's when I realized they were tailing me. I didn't want to drive home while being followed, so I headed toward the middle of the parking lot where other cars were parked. I stopped between two other vehicles while the car that was following me stopped about 50 feet away. I got out of my car and quickly walked back toward the Target entrance. Looking back, I saw that the car's engine was still running, but no one was getting out, which gave me some relief. When I walked inside, I saw a coworker and told them what had happened. We decided to take a look to see if the car was still there. When we got to the doors, I pointed at the vehicle, and we watched it. After a few moments, the driver started moving, then exited the parking lot and disappeared. At that point, I left Target again, quickly headed to my car, got in and started the engine. But just as I was about to drive the usual way, I saw a car coming from the far corner of the lot, and it was heading toward me. I was sure it was the same car. I quickly changed direction and took a rarely used back exit behind Target, which led to a road behind another nearby store. I turned into that store's parking lot, circled around, and stopped beside it. I knew that the car following me wouldn't know where I had gone and would probably assume I'd headed toward the highway. I waited there for a few minutes, and after seeing no approaching headlights, I finally felt relieved. Eventually, I was able to drive home. After that night, nothing similar ever happened while I was working at Target. I never found out who was speaking to me over the walkie-talkie that night, but it was possible for anyone in the parking lot to tune in to our communication frequency. I don't know who would do that, or why.